Welcome, my friend, to the warmth of Baker Street Ember. Settle in by the fire.
As we prepare for tonight's tale, I must ask, from which shadowy corner of the world are you listening? If you find comfort here, please subscribe and leave a like to support the channel. Now,
it is set in late November 1889, during a particularly foggy London autumn, shortly after the Ripper murders have left the city on edge. The crime revolves around the apparent suicide of Major Reginald Hargrove, a decorated veteran of the Second Anglo-Afghan War, wounded at Maiwand, like Watson, found dead in his Mayfair rooms from a gunshot wound. Scotland Yard deems its self-inflicted despair from old wounds and poverty, but Holmes spots embers suggesting murder tied to a hidden fortune from Afghan spoils, a secret society of veterans, betrayal, and a stolen artifact. Chapter 1. The First Spark. London fog pressed thick against the windows of 221B Baker Street in late November 1889. Inside, the coal fire crackled weakly in the grate, sending faint warmth against the chill that seeped through every crack. Sherlock Holmes lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown, legs stretched toward the flames, drawing slow, deliberate pulls from his pipe. The sharp, familiar bite of shag tobacco filled the room, mingling with the damp wool scent clinging to my overcoat as I stepped through the door after a tiresome house call in Kensington. A sharp rap sounded on the 17 steps below. MRS. Hudson's familiar knock, quick and businesslike, followed by the heavier scrape of masculine boots. She appeared moments later, cheeks flushed from the cold stairwell, holding a yellow telegram envelope. "From Scotland Yard, Mr. Holmes," she said, voice low with concern. They marked it urgent. Very urgent. I set down these events as they occurred in my journal, dear reader, for the matter that followed would prove among the strangest and most poignant of all our shared adventures. The telegram, when opened, carried grim news indeed. Major Reginald Hargrove, a decorated veteran of the Afghan campaign, had been found dead in his modest Mayfair lodgings. A single revolver shot to the right temple. Beside the body lay a suicide note in what appeared to be his own handwriting, confessing despair over old wounds, poverty, and the lingering pain of Maiwand. Inspector Lestrade had already concluded the affair, a tragic but straightforward self-destruction. Holmes scanned the message once, then again, his gray eyes narrowing. That peculiar light I know so well began to gleam within them. He rose abruptly from his chair, dressing gown swirling, energy returning in a rush like a match struck in darkness. "Suicide," Lestrade says. "No, Watson. Not suicide." He tapped a finger on the telegram. "Observe this detail they so casually include. The Webley revolver remained clutched in the dead man's right hand. Yet Major Hargrove lost the index and middle fingers of that very hand at Maiwand in 1880. I treated such wounds myself in the field hospitals. The grip would have been feeble at best, unreliable for precise trigger work. A small ember, Watson, but it glows with meaning. The man could scarcely sign his name without assistance. How then does he hold and fire a heavy service revolver with such fatal accuracy?" The words hung in the tobacco-scented air like smoke. I felt the familiar stir of excitement mixed with unease. Holmes was already reaching for his ulster and deerstalker. "We must go at once. The body will not wait, and neither will the truth." We descended the 17 steps in haste, hailed a hansom cab in the fog-bound street, and rattled away toward Mayfair. The cab wheels clattered over wet cobblestones, splashing through shallow puddles of horse manure and coal grit. The bitter cold wind sliced through the apron, carrying the distant moan of foghorns on the Thames and the muffled chime of Big Ben marking the hour. Gas lamps flickered weakly along Park Lane, their yellow halos swallowed by the murk, turning the world into a study in shadow and half-light. We reached the house in Upper Brook Street just as the police surgeon was preparing to remove the body. Lestrade met us at the door, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "Didn't expect you so soon, Mr. Holmes. Case is closed, more or less. Suicide note, weapon in hand, no sign of forced entry. Poor devil had every reason to end it. Debts, pain, no family left but a distant cousin." Holmes brushed past without reply. stepping into the sitting room where the major lay. The air inside was heavy with the sharp reek of gunpowder, overlaid by carbolic soap from the servants' cleaning and the faint metallic tang of fresh blood. A coal fire had burned low in the hearth, leaving the room stuffy yet cold at the edges. Polished mahogany furniture gleamed dully under the hissing gas brackets. A threadbare Persian carpet bore the imprint of heavy boots. Major Hargrove sat slumped in a high-backed armchair, head lolled to one side, the bullet wound neat and blackened at the temple. His right hand still loosely held the revolver, finger near, but not quite on, the trigger guard. In his left hand was crumpled the note, ink dark against the pale paper. Holmes knelt at once, heedless of the soot on the carpet. He lifted the dead man's right hand gently, examining the maimed fingers with clinical care. Then his gaze dropped to the boots, serviceable brown leather, now spattered with mud. Not the clean London pavement mud of Mayfair, but a peculiar reddish clay streaked with black coal dust and tiny metallic glints. Not local soil, he murmured, almost to himself. This smolders, Watson. It will ignite something larger. Lestrade snorted. Mud? The man walked the streets, Holmes. Even invalids go out occasionally. Yet this clay is distinctive, Holmes replied calmly, and observed the cuff of his dressing gown, subtle scorch marks, not from the muzzle blast alone. The barrel was held at an angle inconsistent with self-infliction. Moreover, the watch chain hangs empty. The fob pin remains in the buttonhole, but the metal or seal is gone. Theft? Struggle? Or merely coincidence? I confess I saw nothing remarkable in these details at first. The scene appeared as Lestrade described, a weary soldier, broken by war and want, choosing his own exit. Did you, dear reader, catch what I missed? The careful listener will already have noticed the impossibility of that grip, the strangeness of the mud, the empty watch chain. Holmes rose, steepled his fingers beneath his chin, and paced 3 rapid steps before the dying fire. His eyes gleamed brighter now. A small ember. Watson, did you catch its glow? From this single spark in the darkness, we shall light the whole truth. The first embers glowed in the fog-bound room. The fire of truth had begun. Chapter 2. Gathering kindling. The following morning broke gray and bitter over London, the fog so dense it seemed the Thames itself had risen in vapor to choke the streets. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire had been freshly stoked by Mrs. Hudson. Its warmth fought valiantly against the chill that clung to the windows and seeped under the door. I found Holmes already at the breakfast table, coatless, sleeves rolled, poring over a map of London districts spread beside his plate. The air carried the comforting smell of strong black tea, buttered toast, and the ever-present bite of his shag tobacco. Eat quickly, Watson, he said without looking up. Kindling must be gathered before the fire can properly catch. I poured tea, hot enough to scald the tongue, and spread Mrs. Hudson's excellent marmalade on toast. The sweet citrus cut through the morning's heaviness. Holmes, meanwhile, tapped a pencil against the map at 3 separate points: Mayfair, Whitechapel, and a stretch of Pall Mall where gentlemen's clubs cluster like old soldiers on parade. Our first call was to Mrs. Amelia Hargrove, the widow, in her small but respectable house off Grosvenor Square. The drawing room smelled faintly of lavender water and fresh ink. A low fire burned behind a brass fender, yet the room felt cold, as though grief had stolen the warmth. She received us in deep black crepe, her face pale but composed, gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. My husband had suffered greatly since Maywand, she told us in a low, steady voice. The pain never truly left him. Opium dulled it, but only for a time. Lately he spoke of debts, of promises unkept. Yet I cannot believe he would take his own life. Not Reginald. Holmes inclined his head politely. Did he receive visitors in the last days of his life, madam? Only Captain Thorne, once or twice, and Lieutenant Langford called briefly. They were old comrades. Nothing unusual. As she spoke, Holmes' gaze drifted to her gloves, fine kid leather, one small button missing from the left cuff. He said nothing aloud, but I saw the ember glow in his expression. A detail smolders. he murmured as we descended the steps to the street. Our hansom rattled next to Pall Mall. The Reform Club loomed solid and dignified, its windows aglow with gaslight even at midday. Captain Elias Thorne awaited us in the smoking room, surrounded by the thick fug of Havana cigars and old brandy. He was a tall man, once powerfully built, now running to seed. Scars from Afghan sabers marked his cheek and throat. His boots, I noticed, bore the same reddish clay as those on the dead man's feet. Hargrove owed me money, Thorne said bluntly, swirling his glass. We invested together in an Afghan trader's venture years ago. Silks, spices, a few trinkets from the campaign. He promised repayment when he sold a certain relic. The money never came. I pressed him last week. He grew angry, said the relic was cursed, that it brought only misfortune. Holmes drew upon his pipe, smoke curling lazily. And this relic? A small gold figure, supposedly from a Kabul temple. Hargrove claimed it would fetch a fortune. I never saw it. Thorne's tone was bitter, yet his hands were steady. Too steady, perhaps. As we left, Holmes paused in the vestibule. Kindling gathered, he said softly. Thorne's boots matched the clay. He has been to Whitechapel recently, whether he admits it or not. Whitechapel next. The contrast could not have been sharper. The fog here carried the sour reek of the river, horse manure, cheap cigarette tobacco, and the faint metallic tang of copper smoke from the foundries. Sergeant Malcolm Crowe kept a public house called the Cobble Veteran off Brick Lane. The taproom was dim, warmed only by a small coal fire. Sawdust covered the floorboards, sticky underfoot. Crowe was broad-shouldered, grizzled, missing 2 fingers from his left hand, the same wound pattern as Hargrove's, though on the opposite side. Major got the medal I should have had, he growled, wiping a tankard with a rag that had seen better decades. I carried him off the field at Maywan when the Ghazis were closing, saved his life. He got promoted. I got nothing but a pension too small to live on. I hated him. But kill him? No, I'd rather see him live and suffer. His resentment was palpable, yet his eyes did not shift when he spoke of murder. Holmes purchased 2 pints we did not drink and scraped a sample of mud from the threshold, identical reddish clay. Lieutenant Victor Langford we found at a modest hotel in Bloomsbury. Young, eager, still carrying the upright bearing of an officer. The major was like a father to me, he said earnestly. We argued once over money he had lent me for my kit when I returned from India. But it was settled. I swear it. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Nerves or guilt. Dr. Rupert Hale, the physician, met us at his surgery in Harley Street. The room smelled of carbolic and chloroform. I prescribed opium for the major's pain, he admitted. Increasing doses, I fear. He was in agony most nights. The last prescription was collected 3 days ago. Finally, Mr. Percival Drayton, the banker, in his Threadneedle Street office. He fidgeted with papers, sweat beading despite the cool room. Major Hargrove's accounts were modest. No hidden fortune, merely a small pension and a few investments that had soured. Contradictions began to smolder. The missing watch fob, the fresh ink on the suicide note despite Hargrove's trembling hand, the matching mud on multiple boots, the missing button from Mrs. Hargrove's glove found near the body, the talk of a mysterious Afghan relic. Holmes collected samples in small envelopes, ash from Hargrove's grate, boot scrapings, a drop of ink from the banker's well for comparison. In the hansom returning to Baker Street, he leaned back, eyes half closed. You, dear reader, may have already glimpsed the connections I was only beginning to feel. I confess I saw fragments, not the pattern. Did you? He tapped the envelopes. Kindling gathered, Watson. Smoke is rising. The flames approach. Chapter 3. The smolder. That evening the fog had thickened into an almost solid curtain outside the windows of 221B Baker Street. Inside, the coal fire burned steadily, popping now and then as fresh lumps settled into the grate. The room smelled of shag tobacco, chemical reagents from Holmes' experiments, and the faint damp wool of my greatcoat still drying by the hearth. Gas lamps hissed softly on either side of the mantel, their yellow light dancing across scattered papers, maps, and the small envelopes of evidence Holmes had collected. He had spread everything on the deal table: boot scrapings in glassine packets, a fragment of scorched cuff fabric, the suicide note itself under a magnifying lens, and samples of ink from various sources. Holmes sat motionless for a long minute, steepled fingers pressed to his lips, eyes half closed as though listening to some distant melody only he could hear. Then he rose abruptly and began to pace before the fire with those rapid, restless steps I knew so well. "The embers are beginning to connect, Watson," he said at last. "Let us fan them carefully and see what flame they produce." He lifted the packet containing the reddish clay. The spark, this peculiar mud upon the dead man's boots, reddish clay mixed with coal dust and minute copper filings. Not the black London street mud of Mayfair, nor the grey Thames silt. This is distinctive. He moved to the map pinned above the mantel. The kindling. Such a combination occurs in only one district: the streets and alleys surrounding the Whitechapel copper foundries. The clay comes from the brickfields near the river, the coal dust from the furnaces, the copper filings from the daily hammering of sheet metal. Hargrove, or someone who entered his rooms, had been there within hours of his death. I leaned forward, the warmth of the fire against my face. But he never left Mayfair, according to the servants. He was too ill to walk far. Precisely. Therefore the mud was brought to him. On someone else's boots. Holmes's eyes gleamed with that peculiar light. Now the flame. He paused, drawing upon his pipe until the tobacco glowed cherry red. I am reminded of a curious affair some years ago. The case I have privately titled The Red-Headed League. A man was lured into a sham job copying an encyclopedia, purely to keep him occupied, while criminals tunneled beneath his pawnshop to rob the city and provincial bank. The criminal mind had constructed an elaborate edifice of deception above ground: red hair, absurd tasks, forged documents, all designed to hold the eye aloft. Yet the truth lay below, in the traces left on the ground. The man's trousers were stained with clay from the tunnel. His boots carried the same distinctive earth. He believed himself clever, thought no one would look down when all attention was directed upward to his carefully rehearsed story. Criminals so often forget that the earth remembers every step. Watson. It bears witness when men lie. Holmes tapped the magnifying lens over the suicide note. The blaze. Therefore Major Hargrove, or more likely his killer, had recent business in Whitechapel, near Sergeant Crow's public house, near the foundries. And consider the watch chain. The fob pin remains threaded through the buttonhole, but the medal itself is missing. An Afghan campaign medal, perhaps, or something more valuable, a small gold token from Kabul, pawned, stolen, or removed as a trophy. I felt the first true stirrings of understanding. You mean the mud connects the murder to Whitechapel, the missing fob suggests theft, and the impossible grip on the revolver proves it was not suicide. Exactly. Holmes smiled thinly. The note's ink is fresh, too fresh for a man whose hand shook so badly he could hardly hold a pen. Someone forged it after the shot was fired. I invite you to pause here, dear reader. What would you deduce from the mud on the boots, the empty watch chain, and the maimed fingers that could not have fired the shot? The careful listener will have noticed the inconsistencies long before I did. Holmes returned to his chair, drawing his dressing gown tighter. Looking back now, I should have seen the pattern sooner. In my own Afghan days, small details saved lives. A footprint in the dust of Kandahar, a broken twig on a mountain path, the angle of a spent cartridge. Yet here in the heart of London, the same principle applies. Observation defeats deception because the world itself records the truth. In mud, in ash, in the tremble of a dying hand. The criminal forgets that embers glow in the smallest, most overlooked things. Holmes has taught me, and perhaps he teaches you, dear listener, that truth is not invented in grand theories, but uncovered, one glowing fragment at a time. The observant mind sees what others dismiss as trivial, and when enough embers are gathered, the blaze becomes inevitable. The room fell quiet save for the soft crackle of the fire and the distant clock of a late hansom in Baker Street below. Holmes' face, lit by the flames, wore an expression of quiet satisfaction. The embers smoldered now, no longer scattered sparks but a steady, growing heat. Smoke was rising. The conflagration could not be far away. Chapter 4. Fanning the flames. The next day dawned with a cruel wind that swept the fog into rag tatters across London. At 221B Baker Street the fire roared high in the grate, yet the chill still lingered in the corners of the room. Holmes had barely slept. I found him standing before the mantel, pipe in hand, staring at the small collection of evidence as though willing it to speak. The air tasted of strong coffee. MRS. Hudson had brought up a fresh pot, and the sharp metallic scent of gun oil from the revolver he had borrowed for comparison tests. "We must fan these flames carefully now, Watson," he said, voice low and taut with purpose. "Some will gutter out. Others will grow fierce. Let us see which survive." Our first visit was to Captain Elias Thorne once more. We found him in the same Pall Mall Club, but this time the smoking room felt oppressively warm, thick with cigar smoke and the low murmur of gentlemen discussing stocks. Thorne rose at our approach, face hardening. "You again," he said curtly. "I told you everything yesterday." Holmes produced the small envelope of reddish clay. "This matches the mud on Major Hargrove's boots. And on yours, Captain. The copper filings are unmistakable. Whitechapel Foundry District. You were there recently." Thorne's jaw tightened. "I walked through Whitechapel once. A man may take shortcuts that leave identical traces on your soles and his, and this." Holmes held up a tiny fragment of scorched fabric taken from Hargrove's cuff. "The burn pattern suggests the revolver was pressed at an awkward angle, not self-inflicted. Someone held it for him." Thorne paled but recovered swiftly. "I was nowhere near his rooms that night. Yet your debts press hard," Holmes continued calmly. "The Afghan relic you mentioned, the gold figure. Hargrove refused to sell it, did he not? Said it was cursed. Perhaps you decided to relieve him of it another way." Thorne laughed, but the sound was brittle. "You have no proof." "We shall see." Holmes turned on his heel. As we left, he murmured to me, "A false trail begins to burn out." His denial was too quick, too practiced. Next we sought Lieutenant Victor Langford at his Bloomsbury Hotel. The young officer met us in the small lounge, hands clasped behind his back in military fashion, yet his eyes betrayed unease. Holmes wasted no time. "You visited Whitechapel with the Major, did you not?" "Before his death." Langford hesitated. "Once. He wished to speak with Sergeant Crowe. Old regimental business. I accompanied him for support. And the mud on your own boots matches theirs." The lieutenant looked down, startled. Yes, I walked the same streets." Holmes produced the missing glove button, found beneath Hargrove's chair. "This belongs to Mrs. Hargrove. She admits she called that evening. But why leave it behind? A struggle? Or did you collect it later, perhaps?" Langford flushed crimson. "I swear I had no part in any violence. The Major was alive when I left him 2 days before." Holmes studied him a long moment. "Your alibi holds, for now. But fear not, Lieutenant. The innocent have nothing to dread from truth." We parted from him with the sense that one small flame had dimmed. Langford's nervousness was genuine, but it sprang from shame over old debts, not murder. Mrs. Amelia Hargrove received us next in her Grosvenor Square drawing room. The lavender scent was stronger today, almost cloying. The fire burned low, as though even the hearth mourned. She wept openly when Holmes placed the glove button in her palm. "It is mine," she admitted in a trembling voice. "I called on Reginald the night it happened." We argued. He had grown distant, secretive. I left in tears. I must have lost the button then. Did you see the revolver? Holmes asked gently. No. He kept it in the drawer. He said it was for protection against burglars. Holmes inclined his head. Thank you, madam. Your candor helps more than you know. As we stepped into the cold street, he said quietly, her grief is real. The button was lost innocently. Another false fire got us out. Pressure mounted through the afternoon. Lestrade called at Baker Street in person, stamping snow from his boots on the threshold. The inspector carried the air of the river, damp wool, coal smoke, and faint Thames mud. Still chasing shadows, Holmes? He asked with forced joviality. The coroner's inquest is tomorrow. Suicide. Open and shut. Holmes offered him tea. Open, perhaps, but far from shut. The grip was impossible. The mud points to Whitechapel. The note's ink is too fresh. Lestrade snorted. Ink. Mud. You'll hang a man on dirt and stationery? Men have been hanged on less. Holmes replied evenly. But I prefer evidence that burns true. The inspector left grumbling, yet I saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Our final call that day was to Sergeant Crow's public house in Whitechapel. The tap room was busier now, labourers nursing pints, the air heavy with cheap cigarette tobacco, stale ale, and the sour edge of unwashed wool. Crow leaned on the bar, arms folded. You're back, he growled. I told you, I hated Hargrove, but I didn't kill him. Holmes placed a small pile of copper filings on the counter. These came from your doorstep, and from Hargrove's boots. Someone walked between here and Mayfair recently, carrying more than grudges. Crow's face darkened. Plenty come and go. Could be anyone. Yet you spoke of a medal, Holmes pressed. The one you felt you deserved. Was it on his watch chain? Crow looked away. Maybe. He wore it sometimes. Bragged about it. Holmes leaned closer. If it is missing, Sergeant, someone took it. Someone who knew its value. Crow said nothing more, but his silence spoke volumes. Back in Baker Street that night, Holmes paced before the fire, energy crackling around him like sparks. Some trails had burned themselves out. Langford's innocence, Mrs. Hargrove's grief. Even Crow's blunt resentment seemed more bluster than guilt. Yet others grew stronger. Thorne's debts, his lies about Whitechapel, the missing Afghan relic, the forged note. Holmes stopped suddenly, eyes alight. The true flame burns brighter now, Watson. We have fanned enough to see its direction. I felt the heat of certainty beginning to rise. False fires died in the gathering dark. The true flame burned brighter still. Chapter 5. The fire catches. The wind had dropped by evening, leaving London wrapped in a stillness that felt almost unnatural after days of restless fog. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned with steady confidence. Its glow reflected in the polished brass of the gasogene and the glass of the tantalus on the sideboard. Holmes had been silent for nearly an hour, seated cross-legged on the hearthrug, examining the suicide note under strong lamplight with a series of chemical reagents. The room smelled of warm paper, acetic acid from his tests, and the ever-present curl of Turkish tobacco from his pipe. Suddenly he leapt to his feet, energy surging back like a bellows to a dying blaze. Watson. The ink! I set aside my medical journal. What of it? The forgery is clumsy, once one knows where to look. He thrust the note toward me. The iron gall ink Hargrove used in his letters has oxidized to a dull brown. This note is still blue-black, newly laid down. Moreover, the nib pressure is even, steady, unlike the trembling hand of a man in chronic pain. Someone else wrote it. After the shot, the word struck like a match in tinder. Then we have proof it was murder. More than proof. Direction. Holmes reached for his ulster. We returned to Pall Mall. Thorne has lied too often. Tonight the fire catches in earnest. We took a hansom through the gas-lit streets, wheels hissing over damp cobbles. The cold bit at my ears. The scent of horse sweat and coal smoke followed us all the way to the club. The porter recognized us now and admitted us without question. Captain Elias Thorne sat alone in a corner of the library, a half-empty brandy glass before him, staring into the flames of the hearth as though they held answers. Holmes approached without preamble. "Captain Thorne, the game ends here." Thorne looked up slowly, eyes bloodshot. "What nonsense is this now?" Holmes laid 3 items on the table between them. A small envelope of reddish clay, the forged suicide note, and a single Afghan gold coin, recovered that afternoon from a pawnbroker in Whitechapel who remembered Thorne's visit 2 days earlier. "The coin," Holmes said quietly, "matches descriptions of the relic you claimed Hargrove refused to sell. The pawnbroker identified you. The clay matches your boots and his. And the note, forged in your hand, though you took pains to mimic his script." Thorne's face drained of color. He reached instinctively toward his coat pocket. "Do not," Holmes warned. "The revolver you carry is empty. I removed the cartridges while you dined downstairs an hour ago." I had not seen Holmes leave the club earlier. The realization sent a chill through me colder than the night outside. Thorne's hand froze. Then, with a harsh laugh that held no humor, he rose. "You think you know everything, Holmes. Hargrove was going to ruin me. That gold was mine by right. We took it together at Maywan during the retreat. I carried it out when he lay bleeding. He promised to share it when we returned to England. Years later he kept it hidden, called it cursed. Said he would return it to the Kabul Museum. I could not let him destroy my life over sentiment. So you shot him," Holmes said, voice flat. "I argued with him that night. He pulled the revolver first, threatened to shoot himself rather than yield. We struggled. The gun went off." Thorne's voice cracked. "It was an accident that left scorch marks inconsistent with a struggle," Holmes countered. "An accident that required you to forge a note confessing despair. An accident that saw you remove his watch fob, the last token of the hoard, and pawn the coin for ready money." Thorne lunged then, not for the pistol, but for the door. I moved to block him, old military reflexes still sharp, but Holmes was faster. He caught Thorne's wrist in a grip like iron, twisted, and in the same motion hooked a spare violin string from his pocket, looping it around the man's other arm in a swift, practiced motion. Thorne stumbled, crashing against a chair. The library porter burst in at the noise, followed moments later by 2 constables Lestrade had quietly stationed outside on Holmes's earlier instruction. It was over in seconds. Thorne sat handcuffed on the floor, breathing hard, staring up at Holmes with something between hatred and awe. "How did you know?" he rasped. Holmes straightened his coat. "From the embers, Captain. The mud that betrayed Whitechapel. The impossible grip of a maimed hand. The fresh ink. The missing fob. The gold coin that still carried traces of Afghan dust. Each detail smoldered until they caught together into flame. You might have escaped the yard's notice. You could not escape observation." Lestrade arrived shortly afterward, grumbling about being summoned at such an hour, but unable to hide his satisfaction. "Well, Holmes, it seems you were right again. Murder, then." "Murder most deliberate," Holmes replied. "Though the man may claim accident in court, the evidence will speak louder." We returned to Baker Street in the small hours. The streets were empty save for the occasional night soil cart and the distant toll of a foghorn on the river. Inside 221B the fire still burned, low now but steady. Holmes sank into his armchair, pipe relit, smoke culling toward the ceiling. I poured brandy for us both, the taste sharp and welcome after the night's tension. "It is done," I said. "The fire has caught, Watson." Holmes answered softly, "No stopping it now. Thorne will face justice. The truth burns away the lies at last." I looked at him across the flickering hearth, seeing the quiet triumph in his eyes. The blaze had begun in a single spark, a maimed hand clutching a revolver it could not have fired. and now it illuminated everything. The fire had caught. Nothing could extinguish it now. Chapter 6. Spreading Blaze. The arrest of Captain Elias Thorne sent ripples through London's quieter circles like stones dropped into the Thames at low tide. By morning the fog had lifted somewhat, revealing a pale winter sun that did little to warm the streets. At 221B Baker Street the fire burned bright against the chill, coal settling with soft contented pops. The air carried the scent of fresh ink. Holmes had been writing notes for Lestrade, and the faint, comforting aroma of Mrs. Hudson's breakfast bacon drifting up from below. I found Holmes at the window, watching the hansom cabs clatter past. He turned as I entered, pipe in hand, smoke curling lazily toward the ceiling. "The blaze spreads now, Watson," he said. "With Thorne in custody, the shadows retreat. Secrets long buried begin to surface." Lestrade had sent over a packet that morning. Thorne's confession, partial, guarded, but revealing, and a small iron box discovered beneath the floorboards of his lodgings in a mean street off the Strand. Inside lay the remaining hoard. 7 Afghan gold coins, each stamped with ancient script, and a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded regimental ribbon. Holmes spread the letters on the table. "These are the heart of it," he murmured. "Read this one, dated September 1880, Kandahar." I scanned the faded ink. Major Hargrove, then captain, wrote to his wife of the retreat from Maiwand. The Ghazis had overrun the lines. The British square broke. In the chaos, a small chest of temple offerings, gold figures and coins looted by Afghan irregulars, was captured by Hargrove's men. He and Thorne, both wounded, had hidden it in a cave near the battlefield, swearing to return it after the war or use it only for the relief of widows and orphans if no rightful owner could be traced. But Thorne had other ideas, Holmes continued. "See here, another letter from Thorne to Hargrove, 5 years later. He demands his share. Hargrove refuses, says the gold is stained with blood and must be restored. Thorne threatens exposure. Hargrove replies that he will hand it to the authorities if pressed. The final letter, dated only weeks before the murder, was from Hargrove to Thorne. I have located the Kabul Museum contact. The gold will be returned next month. Meet me at my rooms. We end this matter honorably, or not at all." Holmes set the page down. Thorne could not allow it. Exposure would ruin him. Debt, disgrace, perhaps prison. So he came armed with persuasion, then violence. The struggle, the shot, the forged note to cover despair. He took the watch fob. Hargrove wore one of the smaller coins as a token and pawned it for immediate funds. I sat heavily in the armchair opposite. Then the Major was trying to do right by the fallen, to honor the dead of Maiwand. Precisely. Holmes's voice softened. He carried the guilt of survival when so many did not. Like you, Watson, he bore wounds that never truly healed. Yet he sought redemption in this small act. Thorne saw only profit. The room grew quiet save for the crackle of the fire and the distant chime of Big Ben marking the hour. I thought of my own Afghan days, the dust, the heat, the cries of the wounded, and felt a pang for Hargrove, a comrade I had never met. Reflection, approximately 300 words. Looking back, the blaze of this case illuminated more than a single murder. It revealed how war's long shadow stretches across decades, twisting honor into greed, loyalty into betrayal. In my time with the 5th Northumberland Fusiliers, small acts of courage bound men together, sharing water in the heat, carrying a wounded friend under fire. Yet the same campaign bred men like Thorne, who measured loyalty in coin rather than blood. Holmes has shown me again and again that the truth lies in the overlooked details. A speck of clay, a trembling script, a missing fob. These are not mere trifles. They are embers that, when gathered, burn away deception and reveal the soul beneath. The criminal believes he can bury his acts in shadow, but observation is relentless. It honors the fallen by refusing to let lies stand unchallenged. Hargrove sought to make amends for the spoils of war. Thorn sought only to profit from them. In the end, the blaze of truth spares neither motive nor memory. It lights the path for justice, and perhaps teaches us, dear listener, that even the smallest ember of integrity can outshine the darkest greed. The observant mind does not merely see, it remembers, and in remembering, it redeems. Holmes rose and crossed to the violin case. He lifted the Stradivarius, drew the bow once across the strings, a single, mournful note that hung in the air like smoke. Then he set it down again. The past is revealed, he said quietly. Motive stands plain. Greed masked as entitlement. The Afghan hoard was never Thorne's to claim, yet he killed to keep it. Hargrove died defending a principle few would have bothered to uphold. Outside, the gas lamps began to flicker on as dusk crept in. London, with its endless layers of shadow and light, seemed momentarily clearer, less fog-bound, more honest. The blaze had spread. Every hidden corner stood revealed in its fierce, uncompromising light. Chapter 7. The Conflagration. The morning after Thorne's arrest broke cold and clear over London, the first sharp winter sunlight piercing the fog that had shrouded the city for days. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire roared in the grate, its flames leaping high and casting long, dancing shadows across the scattered papers, the chemical apparatus, and the worn leather of my armchair. The room smelled of fresh coffee, strong and bitter, mingled with the sweet curl of Holmes' best Turkish tobacco, and the faint gunpowder residue still clinging to my coat from the previous night's events. Holmes stood before the fire, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the blaze as though it mirrored the illumination within his mind. Mrs. Hudson had brought up the morning papers. Headlines already whispered of the Mayfair tragedy turned murder, though Scotland Yard had yet to release full details. Lestrade had sent a note requesting Holmes' presence at the yard for a formal statement, but Holmes had declined with a single line. "The truth will suffice without my attendance. Come to Baker Street if you wish it explained." And come he did. Lestrade arrived shortly before noon, stamping snow from his boots on the threshold, cheeks reddened by the wind. He carried a thick dossier under his arm and a look of grudging respect. "Right then, Holmes," he said, settling into the chair opposite me with a grunt. "You've got your man. Thorne's in custody, singing like a canary now that the game's up. But the commissioner wants chapter and verse." "How did you know?" "Walk us through it, from the first spark to the blaze." Holmes turned from the fire, eyes gleaming with that peculiar, fierce satisfaction I had seen so often at the climax of a case. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin and began. "Very well, gentlemen. Let us review each ember, one by one, until you see how they cut into conflagration." He moved to the table and lifted the first small packet, the reddish clay scrapings. The spark, mud on Major Hargrove's boots, reddish clay mixed with coal dust and copper filings. Not Mayfair soil. The kindling. This composition exists only around Whitechapel's copper foundries. Hargrove had not left his rooms in days, yet the mud was fresh. Someone brought it to him. Next, the revolver itself, now cleaned and lying on a velvet cloth. The flame. Hargrove's right hand lacked 2 fingers from Maywand. He could not grip a Webley firmly enough to fire with precision into his own temple. The scorch marks on the cuff showed the barrel angled awkwardly, held by another. Not suicide. Murder. Holmes picked up the suicide note. Another ember, ink fresh and blue-black, unlike the oxidized brown of Hargrove's own letters. Forgery. Steady nib pressure, no tremor. Written after death to suggest despair. He laid down the watch chain, empty of its fob. The missing token, an Afghan coin pawned by Thorne 2 days after the murder. The pawnbroker remembered him. The coin matched the hoard described in old letters found in Thorne's rooms. Holmes paced now, rapid steps before the hearth, smoke curling from his pipe. Thorne claimed the gold was his by right, taken together at Maywand. Hargrove wished to return it honorably. Thorne refused. They argued that night. Thorne came armed with persuasion and a pistol. The struggle, the shot, accidental, he now says. But he then forged the note, removed the fob as proof of his share, and left the scene believing no one would look beyond the surface. Lestrade leaned forward. And the others? The widow, the lieutenant, the sergeant? Red herrings that burned themselves out, Holmes replied. MRS. Hargrove's glove button was lost in innocent distress. Lieutenant Langford's debts were real but harmless. Sergeant Crow's grudge was deep but verbal. Only Thorne's motive burned hot enough. Ruinous debt, fear of exposure, greed for the hoard. When you have eliminated the impossible, suicide by a maimed hand, an innocent visitor leaving Afghan mud, a forged note written by the dead man, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. Thorne murdered Hargrove to silence him and keep the gold. The room fell silent save for the crackle of the fire and the soft hiss of gas lamps. Lestrade closed his dossier with a snap. Elementary, as you would say. Holmes permitted himself a thin smile. I rarely use the word, but in this case, it fits. I confess the blaze of revelation left me breathless. Every small detail, mud, ink, fingers, missing fob, had been there from the first hour, glowing quietly, waiting for Holmes to fan them into flame. Looking back, I should have seen more. Yet Holmes' gift is precisely this, to notice what the rest of us dismiss, and from those overlooked embers, build a conflagration that leaves nothing hidden. Lestrade rose, shaking his head in reluctant admiration. You've done it again, Holmes. The commissioner will have his report. Thorne will hang or rot in jail. Justice served, justice illuminated, Holmes corrected softly. As Lestrade departed down the 17 steps, Holmes returned to his chair, drawing deeply on his pipe. The fire settled into steady, golden heat. Outside, London moved on. Handsome wheels on cobbles, Big Ben tolling the hour, gas lamps hissing into life as dusk approached. The truth had blazed forth in all its fierce clarity. No darkness could survive such light. Nothing remained hidden. Chapter 8. Ashes and Justice. The days following Captain Thorne's arrest settled over London like the quiet after a great fire has passed, smoke lingering in the air, but the blaze itself extinguished, leaving only ashes and the slow work of recovery. At 221B Baker Street, the coal fire burned low and steady now, no longer leaping with urgent energy, but glowing with the calm warmth of resolution. The room smelled of Mrs. Hudson's fresh-baked scones drifting up from the kitchen, mingled with the faint, lingering trace of Holmes' pipe tobacco and the clean scent of ink as I set these final notes to paper. Thorne's trial came swiftly, as such cases often do when the evidence burns too brightly to be ignored. The Old Bailey courtroom was cold despite the press of bodies. Gas lamps hissed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the oak paneling. I sat in the gallery beside Inspector Lestrade, who had grudgingly admitted Holmes' methods had saved the yard considerable embarrassment. Thorne stood in the dock, gaunt and hollow-eyed, the bravado of his club days stripped away. He pleaded not guilty to murder, claiming the shot had been accidental and a struggle, the forged note a panicked afterthought. Yet the evidence spoke louder. The maimed hand that could not have fired the revolver, the fresh ink on the suicide note, the matching mud from Whitechapel foundries, the pawned Afghan coin traced directly to Thorne's hand, the letters from Hargrove's strongbox, read aloud in open court, laid bare the motive, greed clashing against honor. The jury took less than 2 hours. Guilty of murder. Sentence: death. Thorne did not hang. In the end, the judge, moved perhaps by the Afghan context and the victim's own wish for redemption, commuted the penalty to penal servitude for life. Thorne was removed to Dartmoor, there to reflect in the bleak granite silence on the choices that had led him from comrade to killer. Justice, though tempered, had risen from the ashes. Mrs. Amelia Hargrove bore the aftermath with quiet dignity. She came to Baker Street one gray afternoon, dressed in half-mourning, a small parcel in her gloved hands. The drawing-room fire crackled softly as she sat opposite Holmes. "I wish to thank you," she said, voice steady though her eyes were red-rimmed. "Not merely for proving Reginald's death was no suicide, but for revealing what he truly intended. He spoke often of the gold, of returning it, of honoring the men who never came home from Maywand. I thought it guilt. Now I see it was courage. Holmes inclined his head. Your husband sought to make right what war had made wrong. Few men possess such resolve. She opened the parcel. Inside lay the remaining Afghan coins, returned from police custody, and a small gold figure, the relic itself, delicately wrought. The museum in Kabul has agreed to accept them, she said, through the India office. Reginald would have wished it so. She left the coins with Holmes for safekeeping until the formal transfer. As she departed down the 17 steps, her shoulders seemed lighter, as though some long burden had at last been lifted. Lieutenant Victor Langford called the following week. The young officer stood straighter now, the shadow of suspicion gone from his face. He had inherited a modest sum from Hargrove's will, enough to settle his debts and purchase a commission in a quieter regiment. I was ashamed of the money I owed him, he confessed, but he never pressed me. Said a soldier's honor mattered more than coin. I shall not forget that lesson. Holmes regarded him with rare gentleness. Honor it then, and remember the major not for his wounds, but for the man he chose to become. Sergeant Malcolm Crowe proved the most surprising transformation. Word reached us that he had closed his Whitechapel public house, the Kabul veteran, and taken employment as a caretaker at the Chelsea Hospital for pensioned soldiers. The grudge he had nursed so long seemed to have burned itself out with the truth. In a brief, awkward note delivered by hand, he wrote only, "The major got his due. I got mine. No more hate left in me." Even Lestrade appeared at Baker Street one evening, unannounced, carrying a bottle of indifferent brandy as a peace offering. "You were right, Holmes," he said, pouring 3 glasses. "I saw suicide. You saw murder. The yard owes you." Holmes accepted the glass, but raised it in a quiet toast. "The yard owes nothing. Truth owes itself to observation." We drank in companionable silence, the fire crackling between us. Outside, London moved on, hansom cabs rattling over frosted cobbles, gas lamps flickering against the early dark, the distant moan of a Thames foghorn. The city, so often shrouded in fog and secrets, seemed momentarily clearer, as though the blaze had burned away some of its murk. From ashes, justice rose, slowly, imperfectly, but inexorably. Hargrove's name was cleared of despair, his final wish honored. Thorne faced the consequences of his greed. The innocent walked free, relieved of suspicion. The guilty paid the price, and in the quiet aftermath, a measure of peace returned to those who had known the major, and perhaps to London itself. The embers of the case had cooled at last. What remained was not destruction, but the faint, steady glow of what is right. Justice rose from the ashes, as it always must. Chapter 9. Embers cool. Winter deepened over London in the weeks that followed Thorne's conviction. Snow fell in thin, hesitant layers across the rooftops and cobbles, muffling the usual clatter of hansom wheels and turning the gas lamps into soft halos of light. At 221B Baker Street, the fire in the grate burned low and steady, no longer fed by the urgent fuel of investigation, but sustained by quiet routine. The room smelled of dry pine logs Mrs. Hudson had brought up from the cellar, mingled with the faint sweetness of her lemon biscuits and the ever-present curl of Holmes' shag tobacco. The Persian slipper lay undisturbed on the mantel. The violin rested in its case. The transformations wrought by the case settled slowly, like embers cooling after a great blaze. Mrs. Amelia Hargrove emerged from mourning with a quiet strength I had not expected. She visited Baker Street one crisp afternoon, bringing with her a small framed photograph of Major Hargrove in full dress uniform, the Afghan medal gleaming on his breast. She placed it on the mantel beside the bullet-pocked VR. "I have decided to sell the Mayfair house," she told us. "The memories are too heavy there. I shall take a smaller place in Kensington, near the park, and I have joined a committee for soldiers' widows, those left behind after Maywand and other campaigns." Reginald would have approved. Her eyes, once shadowed with grief, now held a calm purpose. Suspicion had lifted from her like fog before the sun. Relief had given way to resolve. She left with a brief, grateful clasp of Holmes' hand, a gesture he accepted without his usual reserve. Lieutenant Victor Langford wrote from Aldershot, where he had taken up his new posting. The letter arrived on heavy cream paper, the script firm and upright. He had repaid the last of his debts to Hargrove's estate and donated a portion to the Chelsea Hospital Fund. "The Major taught me that honor is not inherited but earned," he wrote. "I intend to earn mine daily." The young man who had once trembled under questioning now stood taller in his own estimation. Accusation had forged him into something steadier. Sergeant Malcolm Crowe surprised us most of all. Word reached us through Lestrade that Crowe had not only taken the caretaker position at the Royal Hospital, Chelsea, but had begun volunteering in the infirmary, assisting the pensioners, sharing stories of the old campaigns, even reading aloud to those whose eyes had failed. The bitterness that had smoldered in him for years had cooled at last. One evening a parcel arrived at Baker Street, a plain wooden box containing a single regimental badge, not Hargrove's, but Crowe's own from Maywand, polished to brightness. A short note accompanied it. "Tell Mr. Holmes the ground remembers, but so do men. No more grudges. M. Crowe." Even the city itself seemed to breathe easier. The fog that had pressed so thickly against the windows for weeks thinned. Dawn light reached farther into the streets. London, with its endless layers of shadow and class in secret, had been reminded once more that truth, when kindled, burns away deception and leaves clearer air behind. Holmes himself had returned to his languid habits, though I noticed a subtle change. He lounged in his mouse-colored dressing gown less often. The violin came out more frequently, not in restless sawing, but in measured, thoughtful melodies, airs from the Afghan frontier, slow and mournful, as though honoring the fallen. His triumph was quiet, almost reflective. The blaze had illuminated much, and in its aftermath he seemed content to let the embers cool. One evening, as snow tapped softly against the panes, we sat before the fire, Holmes with his pipe, I with a medical journal I scarcely read. The 17 steps had been silent for hours. Mrs. Hudson had retired early. "You were magnificent, Holmes," I said at last. From that first impossible grip to the final revelation, the case honored the Major in death as he could not always in life. Holmes drew a long pull on his pipe, smoke curling toward the ceiling. "Honor is not in the blaze, Watson, but in what remains when it cools. Hargrove sought to return what war had taken. Thorne sought to keep it. In the end, truth decided." I nodded, thinking of the transformations we had witnessed. A widow from grief to purpose, a young officer from shame to duty, a bitter sergeant from resentment to quiet service, a murderer from shadow to chains, a mystery from fog to clarity. Holmes himself, from bored languor to ignited brilliance, then back to thoughtful repose. The fire settled into glowing coals. Outside, Big Ben chimed the hour, muffled by snow. The gas lamps hissed faintly. A distant hansom rattled past. London continued its endless rhythm, but for those touched by this case, something had shifted, small, perhaps, yet permanent. The embers cooled at last. London breathed easier. Peace, hard-won, returned to Baker Street and beyond. Chapter 10. By the fire at Baker Street. Snow had fallen steadily through the night, blanketing Baker Street in a hush broken only by the occasional muffled clop of a horse and the soft crunch of footsteps on fresh powder. Inside 221B, the coal fire burned with a steady, contented glow, its warmth reaching every corner of the familiar sitting room. The gas lamps had been turned low, their soft hiss mingled with the occasional pop of a coal settling deeper into the grate. The air carried the rich scent of Holmes' best Turkish tobacco, the faint citrus of Mrs. Hudson's lemon biscuits left on the side table, and the clean, dry smell of old books and polished mahogany. Holmes lounged in his armchair opposite me, legs stretched toward the hearth, mouse-colored dressing gown loosely tied. His pipe glowed cherry red in the firelight. Smoke rose in slow, thoughtful curls toward the ceiling. I sat with my notebook open on my knee, though I had written little. The case of Major Hargrove had ended weeks ago, Thorne safely in Dartmoor. The Afghan gold returned through diplomatic channels to Kabul, the widow and the young lieutenant and the old sergeant each finding their own quiet peace, but the echoes lingered, as they always did after such matters. Holmes broke the silence first. "You have been unusually quiet tonight, Watson." I closed the notebook. I have been thinking of the Major, of what he tried to do at the end, of how small an act of honor can be, and yet how fiercely it burns when tested. Holmes nodded slowly. "Honor is not loud, Watson. It is not found in medals or dispatches. It is in the refusal to let greed eclipse duty, even when no one is watching. Hargrove could have kept the gold, sold it quietly, lived comfortably. Instead, he chose the harder path. That is what makes his death more than mere tragedy." I poured brandy from the tantalus, 2 glasses, the liquid amber in the firelight. The taste was warm, slightly sweet, cutting through the tobacco smoke. And yet the criminal mind so often misjudges that very thing. Thorne believed the gold was his by right of survival. He forgot, or never understood, that survival carries responsibility. Precisely. Holmes drew on his pipe, eyes half closed. The criminal mind commits its fatal error in the same place every time. It assumes the world sees only what is shown. It constructs elaborate alibis, forges notes, removes tokens, yet overlooks the simplest witnesses: the mud on a boot, the tremor in a hand, the fresh ink on a page. The ground remembers. The paper remembers. The body remembers. Observation defeats deception because truth is written in the smallest details, in embers that glow when all else is dark. He paused, gazing into the flames. I have seen it again and again. In the Red-Headed League, the tunnel was betrayed by clay on trousers. In the Speckled Band, the bell rope that was no rope at all. In this case, a maimed hand clutching a revolver it could not fire. Each time the same lesson: the observant mind does not invent, it uncovers. And when it uncovers, the blaze follows. I thought of my own Afghan days, the dust-choked march to Kandahar, the cries at Maiwand, the faces of men who never returned. Hargrove carried those memories every day. His wounds were not only physical, yet he sought to make amends. That is what separates him from Thorne. One looked backward with guilt and forward with purpose. The other looked only at what he could take. Holmes smiled faintly. And therein lies the science of deduction, Watson. Not in grand theories, but in refusing to ignore the obvious things nobody observes. Mud is not merely dirt. It is a map. Ink is not merely writing. It is a timestamp. A missing fob is not an accident. It is a confession. The criminal believes his story will hold because he has hidden the large things. He forgets the small ones burn brightest. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a hansom cab passed, wheels crunching snow. Big Ben told the hour, distant and clear. Holmes set his pipe aside and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. "London is full of such embers," he said quietly. "In every street, every fog-bound alley, every shadowed room. Most pass unnoticed. A few catch the eye of the observant, and when they do, the fire spreads, revealing motive, exposing lies, honoring what was hidden or forgotten. We do not solve cases for glory, Watson. We do it because truth matters, because the fallen deserve to be remembered honestly, because a single spark, properly fanned, can light the way for justice." I looked at him across the hearth, my friend, my companion through so many shadows, and felt a deep gratitude. You see what others cannot, and in seeing, you give the rest of us a chance to understand. Holmes waved a hand modestly. "I merely observe. You record. Between us, perhaps, the world is a little less deceived." We sat in companionable silence for a long while. The fire burned down to glowing coals. The snow outside continued to fall, softening the hard edges of the city. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps sounded faintly on the stairs below, retiring for the night. The gas lamps hissed their gentle goodnight. At length Holmes spoke again, voice low. "There will be another case, Watson. Another ember glowing in the darkness. Another truth waiting to be kindled." I smiled. "And when it comes, we shall be ready." He nodded once. "Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot." The fire settled into quiet embers. Peace returned to Baker Street, and for a little while, to London itself. The shadows would gather again, as they always do, but so would the light, patient, relentless, born of observation and the refusal to look away. Until the next ember glows, dear listener, the game is always afoot.